Okay, so with that then, we can begin the meeting. So we need a motion to accept the agenda. State your name for making the motion.
This is Murray. I can accept the agenda.
Hey, here's a question. Last meeting I was on like this, rather than everybody saying they were in favor, we simply called for any opposed. Does that work in everybody's opinion?
Yes.
Okay, is anyone opposed to accepting the agenda? Okay, it's accepted. So then minutes from our last meeting. You have those, they were circulated by email. I think we're going to be seeing them right away here on the screen. Any minutes?
I can move to approve the minutes as presented.
Okay, so moved by Jennifer.
Jennifer.
Okay. Is anyone opposed to accepting those minutes as presented? Okay, minutes are adopted then. So the next item is the check listing. So several pages of checks that were circulated to us. Does anybody need to see those checks? I guess you probably want to screen through them quickly, right, Arlos, just so that all those out in YouTube land can see what we're doing here.
The YouTube is an audio stream.
They aren't going to see it anyhow. So then, did anybody have any questions on any of those checks that you've looked at?
I can make a motion to accept the accounts for payment as presented, unless someone has a question.
Okay, motion by Jennifer to accept them as presented. Is anyone opposed? Okay, those are accepted. On to item number 5 then, the balance sheet. Is there anything you need to say about the balance sheet, Brian?
I don't think so, unless you wanted me to run through the balances in the accounts. It's fairly straightforward, and there's nothing I need to point out, I don't think.
Okay, does anybody want anything pointed out, or are you all good with that?
I'll make a motion. Linda English.
Okay, Linda makes the motion. Is anyone opposed? Okay, that motion is carried. So next, the profit and loss statement.
And like I said, with the profit and loss, unless there's any questions on it, again, from January to March compared to January and March 2019, I don't have anything to point out there either.
Okay. Did anyone have any questions for Brian on profit and loss or not? If not, the motion to...
This is Murray. I can accept the profit and loss.
Okay, moved by Murray. Is anyone opposed to that motion? Okay, that motion is carried. So that brings us then to the audited financial statements. So Brian and Derek, I guess Derek, you're taking us through this, is that right?
Yep. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay? I assume so? Okay, good, excellent.
Derek, I do think you need to get closer to the mic, though, if you have a mic in front of you.
Okay. Or I probably, my wife always accuses me of mumbling, so I might be just doing that. So, but I'll try to hopefully get a little better there. Now. Wonderful. So I appreciate the opportunity to meet with you guys today to go over the audit. Before I take us into the financial statements, whenever an auditor meets with those charged with governance, we're required to go over certain things. So I'll go through those first, and then I'll take us into the financial statements, make a few comments on your financial statements. The first item that I'm required to do is just reaffirm our independence. So, of course, we take steps to ensure that KPMG, myself, and everybody else that was involved with the audit is independent of the commission. The next is just with regards to the status of the audit. So we've finished our field work, and we're prepared to issue an unmodified or clean audit opinion subject to our conversations today and your approval of the financial statements. A couple of other items that we're required to talk about are just the framework used to prepare the financial statements, which is consistent with the prior year. The financial statements are prepared in accordance with Canadian public sector accounting standards. With regards to that framework, there was only one change in those accounting standards this year, and that was with regards to a new standard on restructuring transactions, which had no impact on the commission, but just mentioned that that was a new change to the framework. And within your financial statements, there's a bit of a discussion around some of the other changes that might be coming up in the future regarding those framework. Of course, we work with Brian and the management group to ensure that your financial statements are that you're adopting these standards as they're required and as necessary. The other thing that we're required to go through would be management's selection of the accounting policies and their application. So none of the policies used by management have changed this year. So we have no concerns around any bias on how they're applied. They're applied in an appropriate manner. The next item that we're required to discuss would be estimates. In preparing financial statements, in any of the frameworks, there's always some estimates used by management. The primary estimate used in preparing the Commission's financial statements is the amortization of your tangible capital assets or hard assets. So what we're required to do as auditors is just look to see what the estimated useful life is that management's using. Look at your historical experience and look at your peer groups to ensure that there's no bias or inconsistency in that. So no concerns from that perspective. And then just before I get into the financial statements, if there was any other issues or items that as auditors we felt were needed to be brought to your attention, we'd bring that to your attention now. There were no concerns, no issues noted. So take us into the financial statements. The first, after the title page, there's management's responsibilities for financial reporting. This just goes through to indicate that, of course, management is ultimately responsible for the financial statements. We're required to do an audit. We do assist them a little bit in helping them with wording of some of the notes, but they are management's financial statements. Then we move into the next couple of pages, which is our independent auditor's report. You'll notice that it's very consistent with prior years and that it's an unmodified or clean audit opinion, as I'd mentioned before. Rather than, as it was mentioned, I probably mumble a little bit, so I won't mumble my way through it, but just draw people's attention to the first part, the opinion, just indicating that in our opinion, the financial statements present fairly in all material respects the financial position of the Commission at December 31st and the results of its operations, changes in net debt, and its cash flows for the year then ended in accordance with Canadian public sector accounting standards. After that, I'll take us to the first page with numbers on it, which is page 4. This is the statement of financial position. This is essentially a snapshot of where the Commission was at year end. I'll just maybe wait until the screen gets to that page if possible. What I'll primarily do is similar to prior years, just kind of go through kind of the highlights. If there are any questions while I'm going through this, please feel free to interrupt me. So the first set of numbers on the page obviously is our cash and temporary investments. We see that there's a decrease from the prior year. The main reason for this decrease is as we go through this statement of financial position, we'll note that we have quite a bit less in our accounts payable compared to the prior year, as well as our long-term debt. So when we look at our payables, last year we had a large amount to, I think it was Bow River Irrigation District regarding some of our projects that were underway at that point in time. So obviously the repayment of that in conjunction with our current year operations sees that as a reduction in cash. Moving over to our trade and other receivables, we're down from the prior year. Just again, some of this has to do with timing last year. We had a little bit more in receivables that we did receive or didn't exist this year compared to the prior year. Then we've got due from commission members, so a little bit of a change there from year to year. A lot of that, again, just due to the timing of when we received cash. I mentioned before with regards to our liabilities that our accounts payable was quite a bit lower than the prior year because of that one large payable that we had last year. And we do see our long-term debt has gone down as well due to our regular scheduled payments. Right below that, there's a subtotal called net debt. When we look at it, last year it was 462,000. This year it's 211. So we see an improvement in our net debt position. And what the net debt position really represents is, does the commission have sufficient financial assets to pay off all of its liabilities? Now, even though we're in a net debt position, it doesn't suggest that the commission is in a liquidity problem. It just means that, of course, we have long-term debt, which we've taken on to acquire tangible capital assets. And what it means is that over the next few years, as we're receiving our revenues, we do have to pay off that long-term debt. But we did see that cut in half, and you'd expect that to continue into the future as we pay down that debt. After that, we get down into our non-financial assets. We look at our tangible capital assets, and we do see that that is decreased from the prior year. And the main reason for that is that the amortization, or that estimate that I mentioned earlier, where when we have a capital asset or infrastructure and we estimate the estimated useful life, which is the time that we recognize those amounts into expenses, we see that we've recognized a fair amount of that, and that amount exceeded the amount of new capital assets that we acquired this year. So we do see that decreasing. And then we look at our next two items, our inventory for consumption and prepaid expenses, relatively consistent with the prior year, with just some minor changes as to services that would have been acquired and inventory acquired near year end. Overall, when we look at our accumulated surplus, which is the bottom number, which represents our residual equity in our assets less our liabilities, we do see that it went down from the prior year. It was just over 16 million last year. This year it's about 15.6 million. The main reason for that is that we have that non-cash amortization. So we get down to our statement of operations on the next page, we see that we're in a deficit for the year, but a lot of that deficit is largely driven by that amortization or that non-cash expense. So moving on to our next page, which is our statement of operations and accumulated surplus. This page tries to tell the story of what occurred throughout the years financially. So the first thing that we look at is, of course, our fees from commission members. We see that that's relatively consistent with the prior year, so not a lot of change there. And then we've got our other fees and user charges, so that's again our PGP this year that we didn't have in the prior year. Overall, our revenues have gone up because of that amount. And then when we look at our expenses, we see a slight increase in our expenses as well. When we look at that, of course, one of the things that drives that is our amortization, which again I mentioned earlier, being the non-cash use of our infrastructure, our capital assets. So obviously that we've seen increase over the prior year, as well as the interest on our long-term debt. So as we paid off that debt that we didn't have, we had for the whole year this year compared to the prior year where we didn't have it for the whole year. Overall, we do have a shortfall of revenues over expenditures of 355,000 this year compared to 473 last year. So we do see that amount decrease. And again, one of the key things that I think I mentioned last year, and one thing to remember for board members here as well, is that even though we are in that shortfall, a large portion of that shortfall is really driven by that amortization of our tangible capital assets. So if we were to add those back, you'd be in a net excess position. So again, that when we look at that amortization, that non-cash amount, that really is one of the things that drives your net income, if you will, or your excess or your shortfall of revenues over expenditures this year. And then, of course, that shortfall is why we see that decrease in our accumulated surplus. Moving on to the next page. We have our changes in net financial assets. So as I'd mentioned previously, we're in a net debt position. What this page does is it tries to explain why we see that change in our net debt. So what this statement essentially does is takes your shortfall of revenues over expenditures and adjusts it for items that impacted your statement of operations, but not necessarily your statement of operations. So it adds back non-cash items such as your amortization of tangible capital assets, losses on tangible capital assets as they've been disposed of, also adjust for things such as changes in inventory and prepaid expenses to really show why we've seen that change in our net debt position. The next page is on page 7 is our statement of cash flows. What this statement essentially does is it takes your shortfall of revenues and expenditures, and similar to the statement I just spoke about, it adjusts it for all the non-cash items and or situations where we've had expenditures that weren't actually expenses, such as the acquisition of capital assets, to really get down to what was the impact on our cash accounts, if you will. As I'd mentioned before, we do see that decrease in our cash position as we went from 617 to 465,000 this year. Looking at it, up near the top, of course, we have our shortfall of 355,000. Then we add back our amortization, and then we have our changes in our receivables and changes in our payables. So that at the end of the day, what we see is that first subtotal, we see that our day-to-day operations generated a negative $129,000 cash flow this year compared to $250,000 last year. Now, normally you would look at that swing and that would really prompt a lot of questions, but really the big issue, or why we saw that big swing this current year, is that large change in our payables. So last year we had a large payable rate at year end that we didn't pay until after year end or into 2019, and so that's what's really driving that amount. Other areas where we saw some cash inflows, we saw the sale of our tangible capital assets of $55,000, so that generated some positive cash flow. And then we see, of course, that we repaid some of our long-term debt this year, which represented another outflow. So overall, we do see a net cash outflow during the year compared to the prior year. Again, that's to be expected when you see a large change in our payables due to the amount of activity that was around last year at December. Moving on to page 8, we get into our schedule of tangible capital assets. And what this schedule does is it essentially just shows our the amount that's represented in our statement of financial position, being our capital assets. It breaks it down by land, buildings, machinery, equipment, and engineering structures, as well as showing the annual amortization or the accumulated amortization that has been taken over the year to show what we have as our book value, which is the amount that's represented on your statement of financial position. After that, on page 9, we get into the notes to the financial statements. The first couple of pages are very consistent with what you would have seen. The first page and a bit go over the significant accounting policies used by the Commission. It's very consistent with the prior year. As I mentioned before, there was no changes in policies. Note 2, which covers parts of page 10 and 11, talk about some of those changes in the accounting standards that I'd mentioned earlier. So again, over the next couple of years, there will be some changes that will be occurring there. This is more just information for both you and other users of your financial statements that these changes are coming and could potentially impact your financial statements. Starting on page 11, though, note 3, we start to get into some of the notes that provide more information to the amounts that are on your statement of financial position and financial operations. Note 3 shows a breakdown of what's in our cash and temporary investments. So again, we're largely holding just cash now. If you guys were holding, term deposits, those types of things, they would be reflected in there. Note 4 is a summary of what's in Schedule 1, showing the net book value of our tangible capital assets. Note 5 provides information regarding our long-term debt and the rescheduled repayments of those for the next 5 years. Note 6 and Note 7 provide some information on that accumulated surplus or the residual ownership the Commission has in its assets less its liabilities. Note 6 shows the amount that represents your equity and your tangible capital assets. So that, of course, represents the net book value of your capital assets less the debt related to it. And while Note 7 shows the amounts that we have invested in our capital assets and the amounts that are sitting in our unrestricted. Note 8 is required disclosure around related party transactions. Obviously, the Commission transacts with both the MD and the town of Vauxhall. So this shows, of course, the amounts that are receivable, payables, as well as the amounts that have been charged throughout. Note 9 is some information on contractual rights. As required through the bylaws of the Commission, there's certain amounts that are required to be purchased from the Commission, and so that bylaw exists. Note 10 is, of course, a subsequent event note regarding the COVID-19 outbreak. Obviously, at this point in time, for every type of entity across the world, not just across Canada, we've got this situation occurring that's obviously having quite an impact on operations for everything. Obviously, it introduced a lot of uncertainty. While we don't think there's any significant impact on your financial statements, the cash flows and various other things that could be reflected on your financial statements obviously could be dramatically impacted potentially by what's occurring. That is about a 100-yard dash through your financial statements. I apologize, I haven't had a chance to present financial statements like this very much, so I probably stumbled my way through it a little bit too much. I do apologize for that. Plus, I don't think I let anybody have a chance to question anyways. I think I kind of commanded the microphone here, so I apologize. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take any questions you guys might have now, though.
I would say the one thing that surprises me, Derek, is having a subsequent event note in the statement. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that, but I don't think we've ever been in a time like we are right now either.
Normally with a subsequent event note in financial statements, you usually only include them if something occurred after year end that could impact amounts or items already recorded in your financial statements. So again, because there's so much uncertainty, I mean, for the most part, probably not a huge impact on you guys, but just for most organizations, the collection of receivables can be impacted, the collection of payables, people having to work from home, all these types of things can have an impact on organizations. So you're probably going to see notes like this pop up in financial statements for both municipalities, commissions, profits, not-for-profits. Unfortunately, we're in a different time, something I've never dealt with in my life, that's for sure.
Any other questions for Derek? If not, we should have a motion to approve the audited financial statements. That's the motion we're looking for, isn't it?
I'll make the motion. Linda English.
Okay, moved by
For the
Linda.
audit report.
Sorry, what was that?
For the audit report.
Yes, yes. Is anyone opposed to that motion approving the audited financial statements? Okay, that motion is carried then. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you.
So that brings us on to the operations report then. Ginger?
Alrighty. This is a little strange because I usually never even put one in. I just give you verbal, but figured this way it might be a little easier for you to understand what's going on. We've sent away our biannual water samples to Caro Analytical Services. We switched labs, outsourced different labs. They're coming in about half the price of what Element is, and they seem to be doing really well so far with getting back our results. So I'm quite happy with the change that I made there. Grant Richardson's last day, he moved to another community in BC. We brought John Giesbrick back in from Hayes and maintained that three-person rotation. We've had Clearwater Controls come on site to perform annual service on our chlorine system. That hasn't been looked at by a professional in the last 5 years, and we just wanted somebody to go over it and see how things were running and kind of get everything back to where it should be. And when we had him here, we got him to put in some piping which allows us to isolate the feed system. So if we have to work on it, we don't actually have to shut down the plant now, where before we were always having to shut down the plant. Top technician was on site to perform the annual maintenance and certification on all the analyzers. We disabled the raw water pump at the PGP raw wet reservoir, and that we ran for 3 months. And it kept our reservoir at about 92% until we shut it off. And now we are at 81%. So that's where we're at in our reservoirs. So I went to Banff, and it got canceled short for the Water Operators Conference due to the COVID outbreak. We came back and we went to a 2-person operation. So we're working at 10 and 4 now, 2 of us. And we've kept 1 person out of the plant altogether. So if one of us does happen to get sick, we still have somebody that has not been involved into the plant. We can still have people come in and work from here if needed. Anything else with that? Oh, I have already done up an operations plan for this pandemic. And I've reached out to other communities to assist if they need help and ask for their assistance if it came down to it that we could not maintain these water plants because of illness on our operations staff. I have talked to Alberta Environment extensively with this. They've just actually reached out last week to us all and were wondering where we were and what kind of shape we were in. So I was happy to tell them that we were in good shape and that I had reached out to the other communities and so forth, and the plan was underway, and we're isolating as much as we can. And then on the 23rd of March, we've had a Hawk technician on again to replace the chlorine gateway probe. That probe was the original probe from when we started this plant in 2013, so it is 7 years old. These probes are only supposed to last 3 years, so we did pretty good with that one.
Yeah, really.
So, and then on the 30th, as you can see, I isolated the aeration to the West Raw Reservoir due to the broken discharge lines. And as you can see the pictures below, I kind of, we might have to look into next year is replacing that liner and getting a company in here to fix it properly. I've looked at it, and it looks like it's because of the frost that something's moved and twisted. Mm-hmm. When you take a really closer look at it on those aeration lines, but we're going to have to add some extensions onto it right now, but we'll just kind of wait until it warms up so that the glue will set better, and then we can turn them back on.
There's still frost in the ground, isn't there?
I think so. In some places, yeah. So like I said, we're not going to do anything until the frost is out.
Yeah.
Up there. But I think maybe next year we might have to look at replacing that liner in there because, well, as you can see, that what's covering the aeration lines is all ripped and torn. So to get that fixed properly, it's going to have to be emptied, and if it's emptied, that's the one that we started cleaning it. We had a company come back in 2013 or 2014. I'm not sure of which year it was to dewater it. We ended up doing all the work ourselves, but the bottom is a mess. So it'll be a bigger project than that last one that we replaced. So, but that's it for my report. If you have any questions, fire away.
If no questions, we have a motion to accept the operations report then?
I have it here, and I'll give that motion.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Levitt. Is anyone opposed to the motion? Okay, motion is carried. Any other business?
Next meeting date.
When do we need to meet again? Brian, any thing from your end that you would say here's when we need to have another meeting?
For the financials and whatnot, no, there is no need to meet again now that we got the financial statements approved.
Okay. So what's our regular meeting interval? I forget.
Usually it's quarterly.
Okay. So this was our first quarter meeting? Or no, we're just barely in the second quarter, sorry. So the next one would be sometime after 1st of June, is that right? Any particular time through the early summer that we want a meeting then?
Do we want June or the beginning?
July, what am I saying? So next meeting would be after July 1st, correct?
After July, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm after July the 1st.
Would July 6th work in the afternoon?
July 6th?
It's a Monday as well.
Looks like a good day so far to me.
Well, good to me.
Anybody not like July 6th? Well, why don't we send out an invite for July 6th at 3:30 then?
Okay. Sounds good.
And hearing no objections to that, does anybody feel like making a motion to adjourn this meeting?
Linda, you want to adjourn the meeting?
Okay, boy, we had everybody want to adjourn at once. I think
Well,
Linda was
whatever,
loudest.
whoever wants to, doesn't matter to me.
That's all right, Murray? Anybody opposed to adjourning the meeting? Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.